Alrighty. Well, thank you for joining me again for the Missionary Coach Show. So today on episode 9 of the Missionary Coach Show, we'll be continuing our Missionary Stories series with chapter 1 of Rudi Lack's book called Breakthrough. So, been in full-time missions or volunteer Christian missions since 1999. I'm your missionary coach, Bill Hutchison. So on the show, we'll talk about all things missions related, from preparation, travel, training, relationships, building a support network, and more. So today we're going to be continuing reading of Rudi Lack's book called Breakthrough, Taking the Gospel Across Forbidden Borders. Now, if you do want to go back to missionarystories.org, you can check out the first what are they called? First episode, of this series that we're doing about Rudi's book. The book is out of print, which is why I'm reading it. You can find some used copies if you check out the link that's in the show notes to Amazon. I managed to pick up a used copy, which is great. This is the book. There we go. Called Breakthrough. My signed copy I lost somehow during one of our many moves since I met Rudi in 1999. But it's a great book. There's one copy that is available to borrow online at the Internet Archive, and I should be using that to read to you, so that way we can actually put it on the screen. So if you're watching, you can follow along as I read. But if you're just listening, well, hopefully you find my voice pleasing. I've received a bit of feedback lately that people like to fall asleep to my voice. So still debating if that's a good or a bad thing, that me talking puts people to sleep, but that's all right. We can go with that. So we will read you the book now. Let me just change the display. There we go. All right. So this is his second chapter. So, a seed planted. A gray army truck roared into the missionary compound. Dust belching from its tires, it screeched to a halt beside my van and disgorged a dozen gun-toting African soldiers, all dressed in camouflage combat uniforms, accompanying them for 3 communist Chinese. Dr. Dury and I stared in disbelief. "Hands up," roared a burly-faced African officer, brandishing his gun in my face. My arms shot up automatically. "Don't even think of running away," the tough-faced officer sneered. Nothing was further from my thoughts. My heart raced. My muscles, already tense from my long day's drive in the Central African country of Zambia, trembled from the sudden surge of adrenaline. Dr. Dury, who had been pushing roughly to my left, stood by helplessly. Slowly, the reality of my predicament filtered through my befuddled brain. I must have followed someone. I must have been followed, or someone had reported me. "Where are your papers?" shouted the African commanding officer, pointing his gun at me. Too traumatized to speak, I pointed weakly to the direction of my white Volkswagen van. "Go get him," he snarled. "Rudi, trust the Lord. I'm sure he'll get you out of this," I heard Dr. Dury whisper behind me. I appreciated his attempts to comfort me, but I was in real trouble. So big I did not know if even God could get me out of it. In my wallet was a document declaring my status as a permanent resident of Rhodesia. In 1975, there were no diplomatic relations between Zambia and Rhodesia. The borders between these two nations were tightly closed. In order to get into Zambia from Rhodesia, I had to take an obscure route through Botswana. Had the customs officer at the border of the Zambezi River, where I had entered, known I was a Rhodesian resident, he would never have let me in. I had only shown him my Swiss passport, and that had no record of the months I had spent in Rhodesia. Evidence of my Rhodesian residency was in a separate document. It was the paper of residence that posed my danger. If the soldiers found it, they would be certain to accuse me of spying for Rhodesia. Given their mood, they would probably shoot first and ask questions later. Somehow I managed to persuade my legs to move. My hands shook uncontrollably as I tried to fit the key into the lock. I finally managed to get it open, and still trembling, I picked up my wallet from the van. The soldiers were watching my every move. There was no way I could discard the incriminating paper of residence. "Lord, please help get me out of this hopeless predicament," I desperately prayed. "Get on board," the soldier in battle fatigue ordered. My heart still beat wildly. I climbed into the rear of the open army truck. From the grit and dust, I surmised that it had been used to cart shingle for the Tanzam railway project. Clearing aside the gravel, I sat down. My fate was sealed. African soldiers piled in behind me. A Chinese driver in his ill-fitting Mao uniform fired up the motor. But before we could take off, another truckload of African soldiers and Chinese officials came careening into the missionary compound. They screeched to a standstill beside us. One of the African soldiers yelled, "Wait! We need samples of everything this rascal has distributed." The African beside me shoved me roughly out of the truck. "Go and fetch them from your van." I staggered slightly as my feet hit the ground and gave an awkward sigh of relief. Here was my chance to cover my tracks. Going over to my van, I opened the back and began fumbling in one of the boxes of books I had stored there. I pretended to be searching for the samples that the Chinese had demanded. In reality, I opened my wallet and, keeping it hidden among the books, rummaged through its contents to find the incriminating Rhodesian residency papers. Grabbing the wanted samples, I shut the van door and turned back towards the truck. Behind me, safely buried under a pile of literature, was the Rhodesian residence paper. I breathed a little easier. Now my wallet contained only my Swiss passport, and that had absolutely no trace of my stay in Rhodesia. A soldier pushed me back onto the truck. Dr. Dury stood watching. There was nothing he could do. I cast one last longing glance at him as I climbed on board and collapsed on the truck floor. Two of the African soldiers, their guns at the ready, sat beside me. The other four stood clinging to the side, whilst the Chinese official sat in the front. The truck shot forward, and the soldiers clutching the sides firmly. Where were we going? What would they do to me? By now, the sun had set. As we bumped along in a steady speed, the chilly night air swirled on the open truck, making me shiver. But it was more than physical cold. A dread chill of fear was settling into my bones. I felt nothing like a Rudolph. Rudolph, shortened to Rudi, was the name my parents gave me. Both committed Christians, my father, Hans Lack, was the pastor of several Swiss evangelical churches. When I was born, the Second World War was at its height. Our hometown of Erberg was situated in German-speaking Switzerland, only an hour's drive from the German border. There was a real possibility the Nazis would overrun us. Aware of the threat this posed to Bible-believing Christians, my parents did not give me a biblical name. Instead, they called me Rudolph, which means daring wolf. I'm sure God directed their choice, for even in my earliest days, I demonstrated my love for adventure and daring. We often had missionaries come and stay. As a young boy, I would sit enthralled, listening to their adventures in far-off countries with exotic-sounding names I could barely pronounce. I well remember one night when I was around 5. My parents had invited a missionary from Africa to come for the evening meal. As the evening wore on, they somehow overlooked the fact they had a 5-year-old in their midst. Everyone was so caught up in the suspense of the missionary story that my bedtime came and went without anyone noticing. For my young mind, the excitement was almost unbearable. I was glued to the edge of my seat, nails dug into my palms as I tried to imagine what terrible things would happen next. What an adventure. When I grew up, I too wanted to be a bold and daring missionary, one who would brave the wild lions of Africa, the whistling gales of the Antarctic, the blood-sucking leeches of the Amazon, and take God's message of love to the peoples of the world. Rudi, I jumped as my mother's voice intruded on my 5-year-old imagination. You should have been in bed hours ago. All eyes in the room turned towards me. I groaned in dismay. Now I would never get to hear the end of the story. It was not fair. Despite my protests, my mother insisted I go to bed. Perhaps she thought the story was not quite fitting for my youthful ears. I was marched along the hallway, up the wooden stairs of our Swiss home, and into my bedroom. My mother sighed as she looked at the building blocks and clothes scattered around the room. We'll deal with this in the morning. Now put your pajamas on and get into bed. I don't know how the time got away so quickly. She tucked the duvet cover around me. I looked up at her with pleading eyes. Understanding my disappointment, she plonked her ample frame on the edge of my bed and tenderly tousled my crop of thick, dark brown hair. Sorry, Rudi, but it's well past your bedtime, you know that. Even so, she still took time to offer her normal nighttime prayer for me. Laying her hand gently on my shoulder, she shut her eyes. God, I commit Rudi into your loving care. Look over him while he sleeps and help him to grow into a man of God, one who will take your message of love out to the lost and dying world. Amen. Leaning over, she gave me a hug Against my cheek, I could feel the smooth sides of her hair, which was drawn back into a tightly knotted bun. I sensed her deep care for me and gave a sigh of resolution. Turning out my bedside light, my mother softly tiptoed out of the room and, careful to avoid the scattered blocks, and returned to the dining room. I snuggled contentedly beneath my duvet. The faint murmur of voices in the dining room grew dimmer. Despite myself, my heavy lids were closing, and within seconds I was in the dreamland, forging African rivers, fighting off lions with a long, poison-tipped spear, and bravely talking to strange, dark-skinned people about God. The seed had been sown. One day I too would be a missionary. Then I would have my own stories to tell. My childhood was fertile ground for such dreams. As a pastor's kid, I grew up in the church. Bible stories were as familiar to me as the worn furniture in my parents' home. Ours was not a well-to-do family. Often we could not afford butter on the table. In these post-war years, times were hard for Christians and non-Christians alike, but my parents demonstrated a reality of faith in God. One Christmas, when I was around 7, my heart was set on a yellow postal truck. In Switzerland, mail is always delivered by a yellow vehicle. An enterprising businessman had made a miniature wooden version for children. For weeks before Christmas, I prayed nightly that Jesus would let me have the dream four-wheeler as a present. As was the custom in our Swiss-German home, presents were laid at the foot of the tree during Christmas Eve. I spied a brightly wrapped oblong package with my name on it. I shook it. A heavy object moved inside. It had to be my yellow postal truck. I could not wait to begin playing with it. But I had a few agonizing hours to wait before our presents were opened. I fidgeted and only half listened when at 7 p.m. my father began the ritual of Christmas by retelling the Bible narrative of Jesus' birth. All I could think of was my new yellow truck. Our time of carol singing seemed longer than usual, and my father's prayer never ending. Finally, it came time to open the gifts. I eagerly tore the wrapping off my oblong-shaped package. Disappointment flooded my heart when I looked inside the ripped paper. There, instead of the yellow postal truck, was a wooden red fire engine. "Isn't it great?" my father said, running the engine along our rug-covered wooden floor. "Look, Rudy, it's off to put out a fire." "Such a bright red color. Everyone can see it," my mother added. But their attempts to comfort me failed. I turned away, pouting, refusing to play with the red fire engine, my child's faith shattered. I had prayed for weeks for a yellow postal truck. Had not my parents taught me God always hears and answers prayer? Why had he not answered mine? My parents were as disappointed as I was, but on my dad's limited pastor's budget, such an expensive gift as a yellow postal truck was out of the question. This cheaper red fire engine was all they could afford. "Hans," my mother suddenly turned to my father, "remember a few weeks ago a lady at the church gave us a package for Rudy and told us to put it away for Christmas? I'd forgotten about it. Would you go and get it, please? Maybe it'll distract Rudy for a while." My dad went off and came back with another brightly wrapped package. "Here you go, Rudy." Neither my parents nor my older brother Hans nor my younger sister Esther knew what the package contained. They watched over my shoulder with curiosity. I opened my new gift. Peeling the paper off, I squealed with glee as I uncovered the contents. There was my shiny yellow postal truck. Later, when my parents asked the giver of the gift how she had come to choose this particular present, she explained, "I was in the toy shop and had already selected a gift when I felt God tap me on the shoulder. Buy the yellow postal truck for little Rudy." God had rewarded the simple faith of a young lad. From that moment on, I never had any doubt. I was convinced God cared about the things that mattered to me. But I was no saint. I had a very bad temper. When things did not go my way, I flew into a fit of rage. I would bang doors, yell and scream. I was small for my age, and my older brother Hans bigger than average, yet I still took him on. We often got into scraps and had some wrestling matches in the to-the-death style. I received many severe spankings from my father as a result of my tantrums. I'd feel bad for a while and temporarily reform, but then someone would cross me or things would not go my way, and I would flare up again. One day when I was 12, my brother Hans and I were in our cellar building a pushcart together. The white-painted, hewn stone room with its earthen floor served both as my father's workshop and a garden shed. In the middle of our project, an argument broke out between us. Exerting his authority as the older brother, Hans pushed me aside. That only made me more irrational and wilder. I tried to grab the tool out of his hand. "Give it to me," I demanded. Hans lifted it teasingly above his head, well out of my reach. My fury reached volcano pitch. I grabbed the nearest instrument, a yellow-handled pair of garden pliers. "Give it to me or I'll kill you," I barked, moving threateningly towards him. Although physically I was no match for him, Hans could see from my determined glare that there was no idle threat. I meant it. Staring at the pointed pliers that were only inches from his chest, he began to rapidly retreat. I heard clattering feet as my mother came down the wooden stairs that led to the cellar from our kitchen, where she'd been preparing our evening meal. She bustled into the room, wiping one hand on her apron and tucking a wayward strand of hair back into her immaculate bun with the other. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me with the pliers pointed at my brother. Like Hans, she too knew I meant business. The two of them quickly backed out of the cellar and banged the door in my face. The key was turned in the lock. I dropped the pliers and tried wrenching the heavy wooden door, but it was no use. It was firmly shut. I kicked at it, screaming, then realized I was a prisoner of my own making, without a window even for escape. I sank to my knees on the cold earthen floor and burst into tears. Gradually, my temper abated and my loud sobs turned into cries of self-pity. "Rudi," my mother called in a voice of concern from behind the closed cellar door. "Are you all right?" "No," I sulked. How could I be okay in such a predicament? A mixture of emotions overcame me. I knew I was wrong. Why had I lost control? I loved my brother. I did not really want to kill him. I wanted to say I'm sorry, but I could not. "Rudi, I'm sorry I teased you." Hans' repentant plea came through the door. "Will you forgive me?" I longed to say, "Yes, I forgive you, Hans," and to tell him I would really appreciate him as my big brother. Instead, I yelled out, "No, I won't forgive you. Go away." By now, my father had joined my mother and brother. They all tried pleading with me behind the locked door. I did not answer them. I retreated to the corner of the cellar by Dad's workbench and sat in the wood-chip covered floor sulking. By now, a good half hour had passed. I knew God was not pleased with the way I was acting. I really did want to do the right thing. I'd heard enough of my father's sermons to know I needed to turn from my pride and selfishness. If I fully gave my life over to Jesus, I knew things would change. Yet I found that hard to do. Part of me still wanted to be in charge and run my own life. Why did I have to be so pig-headed? I'd struggled with my explosive stubbornness all my young life. Now, down here in the pits of my cellar prison, I realized it was crunch time. The chips were literally down. Was I prepared to give in and let God take control of my life? Or was I going to continue going my own way and possibly have worse consequences to face in the future? Maybe next time I would not just threaten my brother. Perhaps my temper would so take hold of me that I would go through with the dastardly deed and actually kill him. I shuddered at the thought. My mind was made up. I would give my life over to Jesus. "Dad, I'm ready to say I'm sorry," I said meekly through the cellar door. There was an audible sigh from my parents, who no doubt had been praying quietly during my hour-long vigil. They opened the door for me. Head down, not daring to look anyone in the eye, I silently followed my dad up the cellar steps to his book-lined study. There, I knelt by his wooden wicker chair and prayed, "Lord, I ask you to forgive me for my bad temper. Please come and take over my life." It was a simple request, but one made with deep sincerity. Quietness settled on me. At the same time, a deep assurance entered my young heart. The dreams I had harbored as a kid were not the wild imaginations of youth. God wanted me to be a missionary. My confidence in this conviction remained unwavering as I entered my teenage years. My peers often misunderstood my intense devotion to God. My uncompromising stand cost me friends, but I did not care. I knew where I was going. For my conversion to Christ at the age of 12, my direction was set. I was determined nothing would alter it. When I was 14, our class teacher gave us a weekly assignment. Each Monday morning, starting next week, all of you are to give a 20-minute talk in front of the whole class. You are free to choose your own subject. It will be an exercise in elocution and delivery as well as content. So we all took the assignment seriously. Each Monday, as a different student waxed eloquently for 20 minutes on their selected topics, from cars and sports to other predictable teenage subjects, I pondered on what I should talk about. Only one subject really interested me: missions. Since my decision to follow Jesus 2 years earlier, I had shared my faith with many of my classmates, but I had never talked to them as an entire group. Now, I decided, was my chance. I spent hours in preparation. I even played a colored documentary film on Africa to supplement my talk. I also prayed fervently for God to give me the right words. Even so, when my turn finally came and I stood up to speak, my knees were knocking. 15 youthful pairs of eyes were trained upon my slim 14-year-old figure. There were a few bored snickers from the cynics in the class. I could almost read their minds. 10 guesses that Rudi will speak on religion. Undeterred, I plunged in. God wants to use us to change the world, I challenged them. But first you need to make a personal commitment to Him. You could have heard a pin drop. My classmates were knocked sideways by my bold words. Even my most cynical peers had nothing to say. Such an outspoken religious talk had never before been given. The negative response came days later when I was barraged with snide remarks and forced to duck paper balls thrown at me with cruise missile accuracy. It was my experience in suffering for Christ, but rather than diminishing my faith, this opposition only made me more determined to follow God's call and to serve Him. God, however, was not the only love of my life. I also had a passion for chemistry. I did not excel in sports and struggled with subjects such as French and algebra. I quite enjoyed geography, history, and natural science, but chemistry was a subject where I excelled. Chemistry lessons were my favorite, so much so that I spent most of my free time mixing chemicals, packing them into metal tubes and lighting a fuse. I performed my experiments in our front garden. It gave me a tremendous buzz to see these contraptions fly off like rockets across our neighbor's garden and into the nearby field. While I enjoyed chemistry, I had, however, never seriously considered it as a life career. I only had one direction in life. I was headed for the missions field. I was nearly 16 and nearing the end of my school days when my father called me into his study. Sitting down in the same wooden wicker chair where I had knelt 4 years earlier to make my commitment to Jesus, I glanced around at the well-thumbed theological books that lined my father's shelves. One day, I would be studying such books and unraveling their revelations about God and His ways. Rudi, there's something I want to talk to you about. The serious tone of my dad's voice interrupted my thoughts and brought me to attention. Seated behind his large writing desk, my father looked at me intently through his soft, gray eyes. A little rotund around his midriff these days. He, like me, had been small and wiry in his youth. He was nearing his mid-40s, and his once thick brown hair was beginning to thin. I had always respected my father, and now I looked at him earnestly. We needed to talk about your future. My father leaned over his desk and looked me straight in the eye. Yes, I responded eagerly. My dad had been my biggest mentor in my Christian walk. He had kept me in line and set a high standard for me to follow. I was sure he was about to endorse my long-held ambition to be a missionary. His next words completely took the wind out of my sails. You love chemistry. I suggest you pursue it as a career. I'm sure you could get an apprenticeship as a lab technician at Breakthough. This was a research company only 5 minutes away from our home. I looked at my father, stunned, not knowing what to say. But Dad, you know I want to be a missionary. I started to object. My father cut me short. His arguments were reasonable. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the page to load as my internet keeps cutting out. I'm going to read the physical copy now. I'm sorry. So you won't be able to follow along. So, as one who had gone through a world war and always struggled to make ends meet, he wanted his son to be financially secure. My older brother Hans was already doing well in his accountancy training. In those days, too, it was unthinkable for a young person to go straight into full-time missionary work. Prove yourself in a profession first, then do your Bible training. I was disappointed, but recognized the good sense of his advice. Still, somewhat reluctantly, I agreed. I graduated from high school at the end of the year and duly signed up for a 3-year apprenticeship as a lab technician for Breakthough. These years proved to be an important training ground. a time of character building and installation of principles that would prove invaluable in the years to come. By nature, I am a broad-brushed person, not overly concerned about detail. I am in too much of a hurry to get my job done and get on to my next projects. As a lab technician working with dangerous chemicals, I learned the importance of precision. In the world of chemistry, a sloppy attitude is unacceptable. We were handling volatile substances that, if misused, could prove fatal. One slip and it'd be all over. I learned this lesson the hard way. I was into our first year of my apprenticeship and had been assigned the task of making tranquilizing formula. The process took several days of boiling, cooling, measuring, and mixing the different chemicals. In the course of making the tranquilizer, an extremely toxic gas, phosgen, was released. The white painted steel cylinder containing this poison gas had a black human skull on the side, a sign to all in the industry that this was an extremely potent substance. Even a small amount released into the atmosphere could prove fatal. After inhaling it, the person would be dead within minutes. It could also seep out under the lab doors and kill others. All lab technicians were supposed to wear a protective mask, but the mask was awkward to work with, so nobody bothered. A glass-corked bottle of ammonia liquid sat next to the unused masks on the shelf. If the phosgen was mistakenly released, a whiff of ammonia was our only hope. Even though I, like the others, did not bother to wear the gas mask, I was well aware of the danger. My work required total concentration. I treated the white steel cylinder and its various connecting tubes and glass containers with great respect. One particular day, dressed as usual in my carefully laundered lab uniform, I took the wrench and proceeded very carefully to turn the release valve and allow the phosgen to escape from the white cylinder into the glass tubing. There was nothing visible to see. Nevertheless, I did not avert my eyes, even for a moment. Within seconds, the gas would be reaching the liquid in the triangular glass container at the end of my tubing. As soon as bubbles started appearing in the liquid, my task was to measure it. Right on cue, first one, then more bubbles began surfacing. Everything was functioning in order. I moved closer to peer at the measuring scales. There was a precise amount of gas I needed to let through. Then suddenly I smelt what every chemical technician dreads, a foul-smelling fume of rotting hay. The deadly phosgen was escaping. Oh no, one of the tubes securing the glass valve must have sprung a leak. Fatal white clouds swirled around me. My pulse started racing. Instinctively, I grabbed the ammonia bottle, jerked off the glass stopper, held my neck to my nose, and sniffed. I then shoved the gas mask over my head. The race for life was on. Had the ammonia's life-saving antidote done its work? Had the hydrochloric acid already formed in my lungs been neutralized? After about a minute, my pulse slowed. I felt my heart thumping normally again, and I let out a sigh of relief. The ammonia had done its job. I turned the wrench to stop the flow of phosgen, which until then had been escaping unrestrained into the lab, and collapsed on the high lab stool, my head in my hands, as the full force of what had happened hit me. I could be dead. I could only thank God that a potentially fatal accident had been averted, but I had learned my lesson well. From then on, I meticulously checked and rechecked my instruments, and no matter how awkward, I made every effort to wear the cumbersome gas mask as a precaution. And so that's the end of chapter 1, which I think it does, it's called a seed planted. I think that it gives a good indicator kind of about how God led him into missions. I think all of us who have, it's not just missions, but anything. I think we all know that God has a plan for all of us. And we just need to try to figure out what it is, which can be a challenge. So it could be listening to stories like this. Could be something that your pastor at church says. One of the reasons that I was motivated, I've been thinking about reading this book for a couple months and doing it publicly like this. And one of the things that sort of prompted and pushed me was a new pastor at our church was talking a couple weeks ago just about how God does have something for us to do, but are we willing to actually step out and do it? So here we go. We are reading this book together as just another way to challenge us with sort of what God's plan is. So hopefully you find it challenging. I'd love to hear feedback if you are feeling challenged by this, or if there's maybe someone else, another missionary whose story you think would be worth highlighting for when we are finished this book. So this show used the value for value model, which was pioneered by Adam Curry and John C. Dvorak from the No Agenda show. So this means if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate it if you gave some feedback as a way of saying thank you. You can give back with time, talent, or treasure by sending me your comments, questions, sharing your favorite missionary stories, or donating to my full-time volunteer missionary work. You can head over to missionarycoach.org. You can find links to how you can donate and also how you can subscribe so you can continue with us and follow. If you're watching on YouTube, you can also like and subscribe there. I will be taking down the live video because for some reason our internet keeps cutting in and out tonight, which is also why I wasn't live on Facebook, which I normally am, but the signal just kept cutting in and out for some odd reason. So we will be doing chapter 2 next week. Chapter 2 is called Follow That Man. So be fun to see what that says and where we go from there. So again, thank you so much for joining me. Look forward to hearing your feedback, and I will share again with you later.